And welcome back to Whiskey Politics. Dave Sussman here, the purveyor at Whiskey Politics here at America's Voice News. And you can also find us at ricochet.com and all over the interwebs. Got a great show today. Coming up later in the show, we've got Dennis Prager, Larry Elder, Michael Knowles, and Andrew Klaven live from the premiere of No Safe Spaces. But first, I am really excited about this. Scott Adams joining us. He is the creator of Dilbert, which is hard to believe, burst onto our consciousness over 30 years ago in the newspapers and funnies. He and Calvin and Hobbes were my two reasons to pick up the newspapers on Sundays and get my fingers all smudgy. And yes, kids, we used to actually read these things called newspapers. And Scott is also a businessman. He spent time in banking and telecommunications and referenced his own career in many of his cartoons. He's also a New York Times best-selling author, and his latest book is called Loser Think: How Untrained Brains Are Ruining America. Scott, thank you so much for joining us. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure having you. So first of all, I got to ask you, I read this book, and it was a really great, quick read. What made you want to write this book about, I would say it was more psychology and economics and just the way that humans think. What brought you to write this?
Well, I spent a lot of time on Twitter debating the issues of the day, and one of the patterns I noticed was when somebody disagreed with me but had a good argument, I would often click on their profile just to see who they were. And often it would be an economist or a scientist or a lawyer. And then when I would see terrible arguments, I would click on it and I'd see musician, poet, author. And I thought, is this a coincidence, or is there something about experience in different domains that gives you different windows into the world and makes you maybe a better debater? And so I thought I'd put together a book that fills in the gaps for people who have maybe not spent time in economics. I have a degree in economics and an MBA, and I spent a lot of time, as you said, doing everything from working in corporate America to in 5, 10 different jobs, I suppose. And I've been an entrepreneur, I've been an author, and I'm also a trained hypnotist. So I've been studying persuasion in all of its forms, and I've written on that. So I have a weird experience that allows me to look through a lot of different filters. And I noticed that people who have more filters are just better able to understand their world. So I fill in some of the filters for people who haven't had that domain experience.
So, Scott, you in Loser Think, you provide the tools for spotting, avoiding, and fighting against Loser Think. And I love the term Loser Think. You talk about logic and rationality, not emotion. But I got to ask you, a lot of people, they'll take a look at this and they'll say, Loser Think, well, is this in some way, an epithet or whatever it may be? And I know you talk about this in the book. You refer to, how we use insults for each other, and talk a little bit about the difference between using epithets towards each other or, talking down about somebody and using the term to actually try to help somebody open their mind a little bit more.
So mocking is one of the most important forces in society. A big reason that people don't behave badly all the time is because they'll get mocked for it. And so in order to mock efficiently, sometimes you need to put a word on it, so you've got something to say specifically. So I like to use the example that Elon Musk, when he was trying to tell his employees in a memo how to act, one of the 6 points he made, I think, was that you shouldn't do anything that would end up in a Dilbert comic. Now, because Dilbert was a word that they were all familiar with, and they would know what one of those situations looked like without having a million examples, having that one word for it allows you to mock somebody. And in fact, people used to contact me all the time and say, we were going to do this policy in our company, but we saw that comic you did where you were mocking the very thing we were going to do, so we decided not to. So that's where I learned the power of mockery. And so loserthink is a word that captures all of the bad thinking styles, and it allows you to weaponize the word. So if you see somebody reacting, or if you see somebody debating in a way that just isn't sensible, you can label it loserthink. And then I tell people to just add a photograph from my book of a page that talks about whatever specific problem they're having. So I'm essentially creating a tool to reduce the amount of bad arguments on the internet.
What I found fascinating, and this is something that a lot of people don't even think about, because you know smart people. Everybody knows smart people in their lives because they've been trained in a specific field, whether it's engineering or science or psychology, which is my background before I went into business, and now I'm doing this. But that locks, what you talk about is that sometimes that specialization actually locks you in, and that can make you, limited in your exposure to other fields of thinking, correct?
Yeah, everybody thinks they have this thing called common sense, but in fact, we all look at the same data and we can come to wildly different conclusions. So there's no such thing as common sense. There's only people who have learned how to think productively. And I like to use this one small example to make the point. If you had never heard of the concept of a sunk cost, it wouldn't be necessarily common sense. And what a sunk cost is, for anybody new to it, is that if you've already spent a bunch of money on something, it should not influence your next decision about spending more money, because that money's gone. Now, an economist automatically knows that because it's just a basic rule of thinking in economics. But if you had never heard that, you would say to yourself often, well, I've already put a bunch of money into this. I don't want to lose the money or waste the money I already spent, so I better invest more in the future. But that's nonsense. Now, the beauty of loserthink is that most of the rules in there are just that simple. You hear it once, and you say to yourself, oh, I never realized you should not consider a sunk cost, meaning money that's already spent, in your future decisions. But you hear it once, and it just becomes part of your thinking from that point on.
You split the book into different ways of thinking. You talk about different academics, such as think like a psychologist, think like a historian. I want to touch on some of these because I found them fascinating. And, they talk about personality types, and that you're never just one personality type. You're kind of a mix of difference. And so if we talk like you say you think like a psychologist, I found from my personal background, I was educated. I got my degrees in psychology before I went back to school and got degrees in business. You talk about ego, and you say ego is a tool that we can dial up and we can dial down. I found that fascinating because a lot of people think that somebody's a megalomaniac. They're like that all the time. It's kind of like figure out how to choose your audience, right?
Yeah, if you think that your ego is who you are, you're going to try to protect it because you protect yourself. So you're going to say, I don't want to do something that could get me embarrassed. I don't want to be bad at something in public. And those are all the things that hold you back. Because in fact, most of the good things I've ever done in my life is because I left my lane and went and did something embarrassing, until I could figure out how to do it in a way that wasn't embarrassing. So I actually encourage people to learn how to survive embarrassment. And it usually just takes practice, plus a realization that you don't care about other people's embarrassments. So just note how often you see somebody else getting embarrassed and you really don't care. You don't even care a little bit. That's exactly how much they care about you. And once you get that perspective, it's a lot easier to embarrass yourself. I do it all the time. I'll probably do it today. And I wake up the next morning and my coffee still tastes the same.
Right. So let me address, obviously something that we've seen in the past 10 years, especially. I think you and I have a certain age where much of our life was analog. We didn't have social media. Today, everybody is so self-centered and narcissistic. How do you apply that to the online world where everybody is obviously just trying to fight to be the next star, online YouTube star, or whatever it may be?
Well, there are situations in which dialing your ego up is actually a good thing. So if you're going in for a job interview, or you're competing in some way, or even if you're trying to make a public persona that has some advantage for you, let's say professionally or even personally, there are times when being a little bit full of yourself actually can improve your performance. But there are just as many times that you just look like a jerk, and all it's doing is hurting you socially, hurting you professionally. So you got to know when to dial it up and when to show a little bit of humility, even if it's fake, because that's who you are. You are what you do, not what you're thinking internally.
Think like an artist. Think like an artist. For those of us that are left-brained, you talk about using your imagination. Are we not using our imagination? Are we not being creative enough?
Well, the context that makes a difference is you see this all the time. People will say, well, given a certain set of facts, I can only conclude that there's one possible explanation for these facts. But we should all keep some humility about the fact that we've all had this experience over and over again where we're surprised at the real explanation of something. I'll give you just the best explanation. How is it that Jeffrey Epstein maybe wasn't murdered? Most people think he was murdered because you look at the facts and you say, how could all these coincidences happen? Now, as a creative person, I say to myself, well, let me use my imagination and see if I can come up with another way. Okay, here's a way. Jeffrey Epstein paid the guards to look the other way, paid them to turn off the camera so he could kill himself. And what about that bone that was broken? Well, we haven't heard if it never happens, and we also don't know how good Jeffrey Epstein would be at killing himself. He might be the best suicider of all time because we see that everything else he did, he was incredible at it. I guess he was a concert pianist. He was the best con man. He was the best sexual abuser. He was the best scammer. I mean, he was really good at stuff. Can we imagine that he wasn't good at killing himself, that he couldn't figure out how to do it so thoroughly that it broke his neck just as if he'd been killed? Now, I'm not saying that that's the explanation. I'm just saying that if you couldn't imagine an alternate explanation to him being murdered, maybe it's a problem of imagination, not necessarily an explanation of what happened.
Gotcha. So let's talk a little bit about historians, for example. You say think like a historian. Does history repeat itself? And how we use that?
So people like to use little bumper sticker thoughts that they picked up over time, and one of them is history repeats. But that's an illusion based on the fact that you don't notice all the times history doesn't repeat, which is pretty much every time, because history can't really repeat because you're always in a different situation with different variables, and at the very least, you've learned from the last time something went wrong or right. So history influences the next thing. It's really hard to repeat. Instead, it's just something about a situation that reminds you of some other situation. But that's not predictive in any useful way. The only thing that's predictive is you can assume that people will always be, selfish and greedy and, some other things that people always are. So if that tells you what's going to happen next, that's a pretty good way to predict. But history doesn't repeat. It doesn't have that quality.
Gotcha. When we're looking at this from a standpoint of, I would say, big picture, okay? We're human beings. We're all fallible. We've got 10 seconds on this earth before, we turn into fertilizer. What do you think? You talk about this in the book to a certain extent, but I really wanted to talk about, because these are the things that imprison us, right? You talk about the walls of a mental prison. And I want to get to a little bit of some of the techniques that you use a little bit later here regarding how we break out of our mental prison. But what percentage of, I would just say, normal people that are working for a living, they're taking care of their family, they're coming home, they're watching a little bit of TV at night, what percentage of people focus on things like this? And I guess the question is, if it's a small number of people that are talking about these issues, what would society look like if everybody was able to achieve the best opportunities that they could have within themselves if they were able to expand their thinking here?
Well, I think everybody's trapped in one kind of a bubble or another. So it could be a bubble about politics because you're not watching what the other side is saying, but it could be a bubble that's just keeping you from succeeding. So the ego problem we talked about is by far the biggest. But if you can learn to think productively, people are going to notice that, and that's going to have an enormous effect on your ability to succeed in every way.
Fascinating discussion here with Scott Adams. Picked up his new book, Loser Think. It's fascinating. Got more questions and more discussion. We're going to talk a little bit about his really popular podcast right here after the break. Don't go away at America's Voice News. You can find us 4 p.m. Weekly on Thursdays, live Pacific Coast time. Don't go away, folks. And welcome back to Whiskey Politics. I'm Dave Sussman, your host and purveyor at Whiskey Politics, where you can find us weekly, 4 p.m. live here at America's Voice News, and you can find us all over the interwebs after that as well. And delighted to have a gentleman and a scholar and a very patient man, Scott Adams, the author of Loser Think, How Untrained Brains Are Ruining America. First of all, folks, I'm just going to open this up here. We're having some major technical issues because we were bumped because of the Trump rally today. And I got to tell you, Scott Adams, you are a true consummate professional here. This is Dilbert 101, right? I mean, all the technical problems that we're having, and you and I are sitting here, and we're going to have this conversation. But you were telling me about the Dilbert comic that can relate to this. Everybody's got a Dilbert comic book in their life somewhere, right? It relates to something.
Yeah, one of the things I discovered when I became a cartoonist is there's no such thing as an entirely bad time for me, because it's either going well and then I'm happy, or it's going poorly for whatever reason and I'm writing comics in my head. I was like, oh, that's good. That's good. I'm going to use that. So it's always a good day for me.
Well, hopefully Whiskey Politics won't be inspiration for a Dilbert cartoon, but if it is, royalties.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit. First, I want to digress a little bit from the book and get back to it in just a minute here, but we're watching this incredible charade, the sham, whatever we want to call it, whatever your politics are. What's your thoughts right now from your perspective? I know you're talking about it on your podcast, which is huge. We talked about it during the break. You get such an incredible number of people that follow you religiously. I got friends of mine who love you dearly. What's your perspective on what we're seeing right now coming out of Congress regarding impeachment?
Well, I like to put the persuasion spin on it because that's my background. And one of the things they're doing is the Democrats have framed it brilliantly, and the Republicans have failed miserably to disrupt the frame. And the frame the Democrats are putting on it is that the President Trump, was, quote, trying to dig up dirt on an opponent. Now, that's trying to win the debate before the debate. You're basically defining it as something wrong. Now, here's the other way it could have been framed. The president was doing something that the citizens of the country wanted him to do. They didn't know he was doing it, but they certainly wanted to know, is there anything up with the guy who's polling at the top to be the next president, which is Biden? Is there any reason we have to worry about that and Ukraine, given what is publicly known? So the president was asking questions that the public wants. It also happened to be very good for him. Our system is designed so you can do both of those things. If you're doing what the public wants, you can be as selfish as you want, as long as you're transparent. And apparently the president made the call in front of lots of witnesses and actually even asked for the Ukraine to announce it publicly, which of course, would have been tracked back to conversations with the president. So there doesn't seem to be any sense that he was trying to hide anything. And in fact, the testimony said that even putting the transcript on that secret server was sort of routine. It happens fairly frequently. So all the evidence is that the president was doing the people's work, which happened to be really good for him. And our system simply allows that. In fact, we encourage it. It's how capitalism works. If your capitalists are doing something that's really good for them, as long as it's legal, it's probably good for everybody because it creates money, et cetera. If your politician is doing something that the public wants, but is really good for the politician, that's still A+. That's what we hire you to do. So as long as you're doing it publicly, there's transparency, everybody's watching, we all want it to happen, it can be good for you. That's okay.
Scott, you seem to be somewhat of a pragmatist. I've studied you over the years, and you've called for different politicians from extremes. I mean, you've said some nice things about Bernie Sanders. You called for Michael Bloomberg to run some number of years ago. It looks like he might be running again. Who knows? He threw his hat in the ring in Alabama last week. I know that a lot of people in politics and the media like to classify people and put you in a box. You are right wing, you are left wing. How would you classify yourself?
Well, I often describe myself as left of Bernie, and part of it was a joke because there's nothing left of Bernie. But then AOC and the squad and Elizabeth Warren came along, and suddenly there's something left of Bernie. So I didn't see that coming. But what I mean by it is that on a lot of social stuff, I am left of Bernie. He would like to, I believe, legalize marijuana. I'd like to do that too, but I think it should be extended probably to at least mushrooms and maybe some other psychedelics that have tremendous medical potential. It's very well known. The medical potential is just through the roof for all kinds of things, from depression, PTSD, all kinds of stuff. And let's take abortion. Bernie would be, in favor of fairly permissive abortion laws, and I go left of that, and I say, I'm a guy. I don't add to this conversation. How about if women, as a consensus, make a decision? I'm going to support that because they've got more skin in the game, more appreciation. I'll care if it involves my money. I'll certainly have a say about my money, but if it's a decision of what's legal and what isn't, I'd really rather women took the lead on this and take my voice just totally out of the conversation. And that would give us, and by the way, the reasoning for this is that when you have a law that half of the country is going to absolutely hate with a passion, you have to have a credible law, because that's the only law that people will support. You can hate a law, but if you see that it was arrived at in a proper fashion, the majority wants it, you can live with it. And the best we can do with the abortion question is find something that the side who doesn't get their way at least says, well, at least the way we got here, I support.
Politics, for a lot of people, they think it's simple, okay? And for others, they think that it's multivariate and there's a lot of variables. And you referenced something, and I'm going to get back to your book here, A Loser Think. You talk about thinking like an entrepreneur and that people stay in their lane. When you're staying in your lane, you pretty much are going to stay with the same thing most of your life. And you see people, and you reference politics, you reference Trump, and you reference AOC, two extremes. They didn't stay in their lane. You referenced Trump as being, obviously a real estate tycoon in New York. You reference AOC. She was a bartender. She went for a casting call for Congress. She got the job, apparently. But they got out of their lane, and now they're hugely successful. Is that something that you've related to your own life? Because whether you're in banking and finance or telecommunications or obviously writing comics and now a best-selling author, you've never really stayed in one lane. Is that the secret to success, do you think?
Yeah, well, first of all, the worst advice anybody ever gave is, stick to your knitting, stay in your lane, keep your day job. Although keeping your day job while you're working on another thing might be a good idea. But you should get out of your lane as often as possible and develop skills that you can stack well together. I call it a talent stack. So even if you're trying something new and it doesn't work out, you might be learning something, you might be making some contacts, and that's all good. I mean, think about if everybody stayed in their lane and everybody took that advice, a couple of people who had a bicycle shop would have never invented an airplane. Steve Jobs would not have made a computer. You could go right down the line. Almost the entire civilization we'd still be an agrarian civilization if people stayed in their lane. So you saw me leaving my corporate job to become a cartoonist with no experience whatsoever, but it worked out. Now, of course, the context is I tried other things. This was just the one that worked. So trying a lot of things, failing fast, and trying another thing is pretty good strategy. And you see your examples. The president was never a politician, and there you go. AOC was a bartender, but man, did she get out of her lane and just hit it? So skill-wise, they're two of the best. I'd say Matt Gaetz, AOC, the president, probably the three best examples of people with immense talent that really should not have stayed in their lane. And it's good that they ended up where they are.
Want to get your perspective on media. You talk about the news, and you talk about how in the book you actually reference the fact that you discuss news that the same that all the news reports. That's probably true, but if the political left or the right only report it, then it's probably not. A lot of people believe today, and I am one of them, that the mainstream media is carrying the water for the left, yet they're all repeating the same thing, and I would suggest it's probably 95% of mainstream news. What then?
Well, it still works. So the rule that you mentioned that I promote is that you should always sample the other side. And you can tell somebody who's locked in their silo, and it doesn't matter if it's on the left or the right, because they don't even know the argument on the other side. It's one thing to disagree with what the other side says, but it's kind of scary if you've never heard it and you still have a firm opinion. So I tell everybody to check both sides, and the rule that works surprisingly well, and you have to track it for a while to convince yourself that this works. If one side, and it doesn't matter which side, left or the right, is reporting something as true, and the other side says it doesn't exist, it almost certainly doesn't, because hallucinations are usually additions to your reality. They're not subtractions. Rarely does somebody walk into a room and hallucinate that the couch is not there. But often people will look around and say, there's a crime, there's a thing, I think I see it. When people see something and other people looking at the same scene don't see it, it's probably more likely not there. So that's a good kind of rule of thumb.
The book is Loser Think: How the Untrained Brains Are Ruining America. And I got to tell you, it's a fantastic read. It's a very quick read. I was out of town last weekend, and I read it while I was out of town in just a couple of days. And I got to tell you, it's a fantastic book. Everybody should pick it up. And Scott, would love to have you back on. A little less confusion next time. And if we are going to end up in a Dilbert cartoon. But folks, everybody can find this on Amazon. And where can they find you? What your website is?
Dilbert.com, or just follow me on Twitter at Scott Adams Says. It's all one word.
Fantastic. Greatly appreciate it, everything that you do, Scott. And we'll be back. We got Dennis Prager, Larry Elder, Michael Knowles, and Andrew Klaven here at Whiskey Politics. We'll be right back after the break. Cheers. And welcome back to Whiskey Politics with Dave Sussman. And if you haven't liked our page on Facebook, find Whiskey Politics, give us a like, and join the conversation. We have a lot of fun over there. And just this last week, last episode, in fact, we had the writer and author, John Sullivan, from No Safe Spaces, the movie that it was just premiered this week. It is now spreading across the country, and it is about campus free speech. And before I get to that in just a moment, I just want to talk to you about a little bit about what's going on our college campuses. Just this last couple of days, the Daily Northwestern University outside of Chicago apologized to students for covering what it called a traumatic event. You know what that traumatic event was? It was a speech by former Attorney General Sessions. Jeff Sessions went over to Northwestern University. He spoke in front of the students, and apparently it was so traumatic. It was so traumatic that the newspaper actually apologized to its students for triggering them by reporting about it in the newspaper. This is how far we have gotten, folks. Colleges aren't like they used to be. There is a serious problem regarding free speech and pampering and allowing for safe spaces for these students to not be in any way offended or have opinions that they disagree with. And this is what is essentially the Well, it is the topic of this incredible movie, and I do call it an incredible movie because I've seen it. I've seen it not just this last week at the premiere in Hollywood at Chinese Theater, but I saw it 2 years ago in a different form, and it had been worked on for 2 years, and boy, has it improved dramatically, and it is one of the most compelling and important movies of the year. Here's the trailer for No Safe Spaces.
You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say will be used against you.
You are not listening. I want your job to be taken from you.
A protest has turned violent in California, Berkeley.
This is why we're fighting for the soul of America.
You should be able to share ideas without fear of being fired from your job or shouted down.
You are not to be heard. This is one of the few things one could say we have no precedent for in the United States.
You have the right to remain silent.
The only way we separate the good ideas from the bad ideas is to be free to say whatever we want about them.
Anything you say will be used against you.
There's no free speech for fascists.
Your posts on Facebook, Twitter, and social media will be saved to shame you.
Kevin Hart has stepped down from hosting this year's Oscars.
Anything you say that we don't like will be used to shut you up. You can't be funny.
It's creating an atmosphere of fear and repression, and it's gonna bust.
You cannot think differently.
It makes it difficult for you to learn from other people.
Isn't it spooky that we're having this discussion?
You can't challenge us.
Kids grew up dipped in Purell, playing soccer games where they never kept score.
There is no debate.
The type of diversity that they hate is diversity of thought.
We reserve the right to be offended by everything.
No university should ever create a safe space.
You're not going to protect people, and so the best you can do is to make them strong.
It bothers me for the young people who are being deprived of anything that could open their minds.
You have the right to remain silent.
When you see a trailer like that, you think, it's just hyperbole and, it's just a lot of right-wing propaganda. It isn't. There's folks from the left in this movie. There's center people. There's independent thinkers. This isn't a conservative issue, folks. This is a constitutional issue. This is a issue about the rights. The number one right that we have as Americans is the right to free speech. This is what differs us from other countries, that we should be able to say what we want to say. And I should be able to say, I disagree with what you're saying, and here's the reasons why. If you're a Nazi, I'm going to argue with you because I think that you're wrong. But what our students are now learning in colleges across this country and throughout the world is what we just saw with Northwestern. They plan to move forward by, quote, unquote, vigorously not reporting on any future events that may cause similar, quote, unquote, trauma, where the Attorney General, former Attorney General of the United States, Jeff Sessions, came in to speak on campus, invited by the Republicans, and people are now having trauma because of it? This is incredible. Here's a clip of me speaking with Dennis Prager on the red carpet on the premiere of No Safe Spaces. How do we have the discussion when people are saying that the idea of having a disagreement with me means that you are racist, you're a homophobe, you're a bigot, you're evil? How do we have that dialogue with somebody like that, which seems to be represented today by an extreme number of people on the left?
I'm not sure that it's possible. It's a very sad thing. We don't break off relations with them. They break off relations with us. If you hear about a child who won't speak to their parents because of how they voted, do you assume the child is a conservative whose parents voted for Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama? Of course not. You think of a child whose parents voted for Barack Obama. We don't sever relations with them. They sever relations with us. They're meaner. I'm sorry, that's just a fact. I wish it weren't true. Not liberals, leftists. I always divide between liberals and leftists.
Where's the discussion for us to have about classic liberalism today? How do kids and people learn about classic liberalism versus leftism?
The protectors, it's a very complex issue. The protectors of liberalism today are conservatives. free speech was a liberal, was a sacrosanct liberal value, and still is. But it was never a left-wing value. The left has never been for free speech or any other freedom. So the battle, in my opinion, is to show liberals that conservatives are not their enemy, the left is. Alan Dershowitz knows that. He says that in the film. It's one of the most powerful scenes, in my opinion, him talking to me in his apartment in Manhattan.
This film was started to be, I saw this 2 years ago at Freedom Fest. I know it's been changed a lot in the last 2 years.
Yes.
In 2 years, has the situation progressed further to the worse?
It's worse than ever, that's correct. I mean, look at Jordan Peterson, who's, they can't show the film about him in Canada, in most Canadian places. What is wrong with Jordan Peterson? That he doesn't think that Ontario can pass a law on what pronouns you use? That's it? That's the extent of his so-called bigotry? It's very scary stuff.
Where does this anger come from?
It comes from ingratitude. Ungrateful people are all angry. Grateful people are not angry. Leftists are not grateful for being Americans. It almost, I'm grateful every day that I'm an American. I know it's flaws, but I thank God.
Last question for you, and I have to ask you because you're here. We see AOC +3, the squad, Ilhan Omar, the anti-Semitism. There was just a whole slate of tweets that just came out recently regarding AOC talking about Israel and Jewish support. What will it take for Jews? You and I had you last time on this, and I asked you a similar question, to wake up regarding the left and the they call it anti-Zionism, it's anti-Semitism.
If the Jews have not awakened yet to the fact that the left, which has always been anti-Jewish, is still anti-Jewish, not liberals, leftists, then they won't wake up. It has never been different, ever. The left, from Marx to Lenin to Trotsky to Soros, has been anti-Jewish and anti-Israel, including leftist Jews.
Are you seeing any Jexit, any movement?
No. I wish I did. I work on it, but as a rule, all rules have exceptions. The Jews who leave traditional Judaism create secular religions as substitutes. Marxism, humanism, communism, socialism, environmentalism, feminism. Jews have either founded those movements or lead them.
Let's talk to you for another hour. Thank you, everything you do, sir. Thank you.
Appreciate it a lot.
And we also spoke with Andrew Klavan from the Daily Wire about free speech.
Yes, it has. I mean, it's out in the open now. I mean, it's out in the open that, like, the New York Times is basically saying that free speech is dangerous. That free speech is the instrument of oppression. When you have a central newspaper, the central voice of the left, saying that, this is no longer a secret. This is an open attack on our institutions and on free speech. And when you feel fine about shouting people down, about closing people out, about knocking them off Twitter, when you're pressuring Facebook not to take ads and basically have convinced Twitter not to take political ads, you are really in a battle for that free speech right. And free speech is the foundational right of freedom. There's nothing else after that.
Okay, let's suggest, for example, that we can get rid of the 10% of the extremes, commonly known as Twitter, okay, and you bring the 80% together and you sit down and have a discussion about this. The idea from the left right now is that there's no diversity of ideas if I disagree with what you're saying, right? Where does the conversation begin to bring people together to understand the importance of the First Amendment and being able to disagree with somebody?
Well, we have to walk into these places. I mean, I do this, all my friends do this. We go to colleges and we talk, and the people scream at us and they call us names and they deface our posters, and we have to just keep doing it so that people, once you look at me and once you hear what I have to say, you realize it's not hateful. It's simply logic. It's simply reasonable. And all I want is for people to be free. I don't really care how people live. It's their business. I think there are smart ways to live and stupid ways, but ultimately it's your choice. It's just, I want people to be free, and these kids are willing to give up their freedom, their economic freedom, their social freedom, their freedom of speech, and you've got to start talking to them about what they're giving away, because once it's gone, it's very hard to get back.
where is the discussion about education of classic liberalism anymore?
Yeah, no, they've actually crushed that. And what they do is they racialize everything. They say, well, this was done by white people and therefore it's no good. But really what you should do is you should have gratitude for everything that's handed down to you. I mean, these are ideas that are universal, and it doesn't really matter who came up with them. It doesn't matter who wrote the Constitution, who wrote the Declaration. Those ideas apply to everybody. And so by racializing them, they make people think that they're in a battle against their own best interests. They convince the students to be at war with their own freedom, and we have to convince them that that's a war you can't win.
Andrew Klavan, looking forward to listening to your show every day. Thank you so much for what you do. And stick through the break, folks. We're going to be right back with Michael Knowles and Larry Elder. Dave Sussman here at Whiskey Politics. Don't go away. And welcome back to Whiskey Politics. And if you haven't followed us on Facebook, please find the Whiskey Politics Facebook page. Click on like, and that way you can stay updated with all of our new content that we've got coming out every week. And we're also having a lot of fun on there every single day. Whiskey Politics on Facebook, and you can follow me at David Sussman on Twitter. And also find me at America's Voice News daily, Monday through Friday from 11 to 1 Pacific time. So talking about no safe spaces, what is going on our college campuses here? And one of the individuals that is front and center on college campuses, recently attacked on a college campus, is Michael Knowles from the Daily Wire. And Michael joins me at the premiere at Grauman's Chinese Theater this week of No Safe Spaces. Here's Michael. Okay, Michael Knowles, Daily Wire. You have your own show every day. Yes. Michael Knowles Show. One of the questions that's come up, obviously we're talking about free speech. You're on campus, and one of the questions that I've asked other people here, and I want to get your perspective because you're on the front lines. Obviously the millennials are lost. Is Gen Z going to come and save us?
So if you look at the statistics, Gen Z is actually even worse than the millennials. They're more likely to support socialism. They know less about their country. But the thing I like about the Gen Z, especially anecdotally, is they're curious. They're not as locked into this kind of rigid liberalism and leftism as the millennials are. I think they're exploring questions. I think if there is hope, the hope is in the Zoomers.
Zoomers. Zoomers. That's what they are?
They're the boomers of the Gen Z.
All right. They're calling me boomer now. I'm not a boomer. I'm Gen X, man. What happened to my generation? They forgot about us.
They call me a boomer, too, depending on what kind of, lame jokes I'm telling. That's kind of what
there you go. Dad jokes will give you the... Okay. Let's take the extremes out of the equation. I'm talking about Twitter. All right. The 80% around the middle. How do we bring people together outside of another 9/11?
So outside of an external force, what you have to do is have an identity politics of a root identity. So not these kind of silly identity politics of race or sex or sexual preference, these things that simply divide us, but an identity politics of a cultural identity, a love of country, and ultimately a religious revival, because as the patron saint of Hollywood conservatives, Andrew Breitbart, would say, politics is downstream of culture, and culture, we know, is downstream of religion. Cult and culture are related, and what a culture worships is going to define that culture. Are we going to have a godly culture? Are we going to come together and be united in a coherent culture? Or are we going to be lost in this culture of the self? Doesn't look good right now, but I have hope.
We talk about the crazies on college campus. My son is a freshman. He's at Cronkite School of Journalism, Sports Broadcasting. They don't have that on his campus. It's actually one of the few schools out there that is rated as being independently minded, okay? But so when I take a look at that, and I just got back yesterday, watched the ASU-USC game on Saturday, and I think to myself, okay, I just got back from a college campus. Is it ubiquitous across all campuses, or is it just in the pockets that we're hearing in our echo chamber media?
It's almost ubiquitous. There are some holdouts, some great schools like Hillsdale, say, or like Franciscan of Steubenville, or Thomas Aquinas College. There are these few. They are the exception, though. The American university structure has become rotted out from within, rotted to the core, because leftists moved through those institutions, and they told us they were doing it, and they did it for 50 years. I think conservatives get impatient. We want to just donate to one election or one this or that. Yeah. That's not how it's going to work. You've got to take your time, have patience, and not cede those institutional grounds, whether it's at universities or here in Hollywood.
Yeah. Last question for you. I know you're busy. I saw this film 2 years ago at Freedom Fest, and I know it's been upgraded and changed and everything since, but in the 2 years, has the situation gotten worse?
In Hollywood or around the country?
Well, I guess around the country.
I think in Hollywood it's gotten worse. I think around the country it's gotten a lot better, because what Hollywood is sort of a symbol of the university structure, the media structure, that kind of leftist institutional structure. They've gotten shriller and angrier and crazier. But I think around the country, Americans are waking up to this. They are not going to tolerate it anymore. The conservatives and the middle and the regular people are fighting back, and we're not going to allow some leftist administrator or some other gatekeeper of the left shut us up anymore.
Looking forward to seeing you at the Cigar Group.
I can't wait to see you there.
All right, thanks, bud. Michael's a great guy. He's a good friend. And, I make a lot of friends at these places that I go to. I've done a lot of these red carpet events. And sometimes producer is with me and handling all the technology. And sometimes I do it solo. And I ran in huffing and puffing that night. And unfortunately, we got Dave Rubin. We got Adam Carolla. I had Ben Shapiro. And the microphone wasn't on. I know. It was crazy. So I'm very fortunate that we got these. And we also got Larry Elder, the sage of South Central, who I've had all of these folks on Whiskey Politics before, long form, but you got to check out the episodes of Larry Elder. He's phenomenal, and one of the more popular ones that we've had on YouTube as well. Here's Larry Elder. See you, man. How you doing? I love the jacket.
Thank you.
Dude, you look like Steve Austin, Bionic Man.
Action hero, yeah.
You need a red one, though.
I got tights on, too. You want to see those?
No.
No, I don't.
How you doing?
I'm doing great.
Good. Okay. So, Sage of South Central, Larry Elder, ladies and gentlemen. So let's talk a little bit about the idea. Obviously, we're talking about free speech here. You're on the front lines every single day. Right. You disagree with somebody. They disagree with you because you are evil.
Right.
Okay. It isn't that they disagree with your ideas. Is that they are going to give you, they're going to basically say that you're just a horrible human being. Right. How do you have a discussion with somebody that comes from that perspective?
Well, you really can't, can you? And that's one of the reasons I think Dennis and Adam made this movie, to show how ridiculous that is. I mean, I thought they were the tolerant people, the open-minded people. Right. But you have a point of view that's different from theirs, and they want to shut you down. It's one thing to say I disagree with you. It's another thing to say I disagree with you, and you ought not have a right to even give your opinion. I just spoke at Gonzaga University a few days
Washington.
ago. Yeah, and I understand that Ben Shapiro was invited. There was such controversy, he ended up not speaking there. What is that? I mean, my goodness, you can't even have a different point of view. You can't talk about limited taxes, about supporting our national security, about believing in the Second Amendment without being called a Nazi or a fascist. It's ridiculous. And that's where we are right now in this country.
President Trump just came back from the Black Voter Initiative in Atlanta, Georgia on Friday. I think we were talking about it on the show. Brexit and the whole thing about all of this. Is there a movement? Because they're saying that there is and they're saying that there isn't. It depends upon who you talk to.
There most certainly is a movement. And by the way, speaking of documentaries, I have one coming out in a few months called Uncle Tom, where I talk about the phenomenon of blacks who dare to divorce themselves even a little bit from the Democratic Party, and they're getting hammered as Uncle Toms and sellouts. I believe that Donald Trump has a chance of getting between 15 and 20% of the black vote, in large part because of this extraordinary economy.
From 8%? Is that what it was?
Yeah, a little more than 6%, around 7% He got more than Mitt Romney did, which wasn't very much. But I believe there's a chance for Donald Trump to triple that, maybe even quadruple that, in large part because of the economy, and then prison reform. About 90% of the people that have benefited from that have been black. And the other reason is he supports choice in public education. And while there's not a whole lot you can do about that from the federal level, but at least having a point of view to encourage local jurisdictions to allow parents to have choice. I went to Crenshaw High School, and a few years ago there was a front page article about Crenshaw in the LA Times that said only 3% of kids can do math at grade level. And Ice-T went to my high school 10 years later, and he told me he chose it because it's a Crip school. Now, what parent sends their kid to a school that's a Crip school where only 3% can do math at grade level if they have an option? Republicans want to give inner city parents the option. Democrats don't. Who loves you? Who's on your side?
Do you talk with Ice-T? Do you have a relationship?
I've interviewed him one time.
Okay.
And I talked to him about what I thought was his hypocrisy, because here he is. Cop killer, and now he plays cops.
Right.
And he said, yeah, you're right, it is hypocritical.
Okay, that's good.
Yeah, at least he was honest.
Right, absolutely.
At least he's honest about his hypocrisy.
Yeah, absolutely. Trajectory, okay? Classic liberalism seems to be thrown away by the discussion on the left, at least as an option, okay? JFK would be a hardcore Republican in their mind today. Ask, not what a country can do for you and so on.
Right.
Trajectory, what are you looking at right now? Are the kids going to grow up with more entitlement, less free speech, or is it going to turn?
That's the $64,000 question. election, I don't know how it's going to turn. I'm cautiously pessimistic, as I always say. The idea that a majority of young people support socialism, which means government ownership of means of production, is scary. The idea that a lot of people would repeal the Second Amendment if they could, it's scary. The idea that nobody seems to care about how many Americans defend themselves every year with firearms, and that the Second Amendment purpose is to prevent a tyrant, all this stuff is scary to me. That people don't appreciate the Constitution is a document that restrains federal government. It doesn't empower the federal government. All these kinds of things are very, very dangerous. And we have these left-wing professors, left-wing people running Hollywood, and left-wing people in the news media that form what I call the axis of indoctrination, and it has to be fought.
I have a 2-hour show every day on America's Voice News. It's a new platform, and we're out there, and we're having these discussions every single day. Real quick, last question for you. New media, you're on Salem Radio Network, you're all over the country, very, very well known. Is there room for new media in this landscape right now, or are you concerned about the lack of money from the conservative?
I wouldn't say there's room for it. I'd say there's a desperate need for new media. You are the alternative. You are the alternative to the New York Times, CNN. We see how corrupt they are. ABC just spiked a Jeffrey Epstein story we found out. NBC spiked the Harvey Weinstein story. New York Times had all sorts of documents showing that Elizabeth Warren was not telling the truth when she said she lost her job because she got pregnant and sat on it. We need people like you. Otherwise, we're being manipulated, told what to say, what to see, what to think, how to think. This is 1984. We got to fight this.
Sage South Central, Larry Elder. Oh, man. All those guys are great guys, and we had several more interviews there as well. Everybody check out No Safe Spaces. Go and support this film. It really is an important film. Take your children to go see it. Take your friends to go see it, and then see it again, because a movie like this needs to get the attention. Because, listen, you go to some of these college campuses, they're taking down statues. Okay, there's groups that are out there that are fighting for the American flag to be placed on campus. Think about that. And I have no problem with anybody having the right to protest something that they are against, but they have no right to be insulated from it. That's the difference, and that is what these kids in colleges are now demanding. Simply because it hurts their feelings. And think, if you enshrine that kind of safety on education, you're going to have to eliminate anything and everything that promotes uneasiness, anxiety, or discomfort for the rest of their lives. And guess what, folks? That isn't real life. And we're now seeing that now percolating into the media. So we're going to be back again real soon with Key Politics, this time next week, Thursdays at 4 p.m. here at America's Voice News. Don't go away, and thanks for joining me. Cheers, everybody.